It was a beautiful, sunny day, and the main character was returning from school with her friend. Suddenly, her friend turned and asked Julia if the boy standing nearby was her older brother. She was almost certain it was him. Julia looked in the direction her friend pointed and confirmed that it was, without a doubt, her brother. He seemed distracted, focused on something on his phone. Julia's friend commented that her brother was a real heartthrob, and she began to insist that Julia introduce them. But the protagonist didn't want to at all. She never understood why girls found her brother so charming, and usually preferred to pretend they weren't related when they were out in public. She told her friend to leave her alone, as she had no intention of striking up a conversation with him. It was already enough to deal with him at home. However, her friend soon noticed another boy had approached. Julia's cheeks turned slightly red as she recognized her neighbor. Back at home, Julia announced her arrival, but she quickly realized her brother hadn't returned yet. She figured he was probably getting something to eat with their neighbor, and went straight to take a shower. Still thinking about how surprised she was to see her neighbor earlier, wearing that suit at the university, the hot water slid over her body as she admitted to herself that he had become so charming. Or maybe it was just the suit that made him look so attractive. After her shower, she wrapped her hair in a towel, put on some facial patches, and wondered why her brother still hadn't arrived. Since it was almost time for dinner, she decided to call him and ask when he'd be back. Carlos, surprised, wanted to know why she was asking. She explained that dinner was almost ready and she was waiting for him. This annoyed him a little, and he retorted, saying he wasn't her private chef and that she could make her own meal. She started to protest, so Carlos suggested she come to the restaurant where they were, since Damon was paying. Upon hearing this, Julia was thrilled and said she'd get ready immediately to meet them. Later, when she arrived at the restaurant, she surprised them at the table. Damon wanted to know why Julia had decided to show up. Carlos nonchalantly replied that he couldn't let his little troublemaker of a sister starve. Meanwhile, Julia smiled contentedly and greeted the neighbor. He, in turn, sighed and commented that the two of them were real mooches. Carlos didn't mind the teasing and lightly patted his sister on the back, telling her to order whatever she wanted. Julia called the waiter over and began to list the dishes she wanted. Noticing Damon staring at her, she asked why he was looking at her like that, or if he was worried about the bill. He just smiled, shaking his head, and said it was nothing, resting his chin on his hand. He commented that he always saw her as the little girl she used to be, and asked when she had grown up enough to be drinking alcohol. Julia replied that she was only 3 years younger than him, so she didn't think the difference was that big. Her eyes lingered on the clothes he was wearing, and she was curious, asking why he was dressed like that. In the next instant, Damon took off his suit jacket and explained that he had attended a cousin's wedding. Her eyes remained fixed on him as he loosened his tie. Noticing her attentive gaze, Damon asked her what she thought of the suit. She became completely flustered, not knowing what to say, while Carlos smiled and said that kind of clothing didn't suit him at all. Damon teased back, saying that Carlos should at least try to wear a decent suit once in his life. As the drinks arrived at the table, he sighed and told them to simply start drinking. Julia immediately grabbed her glass and began taking large gulps. Damon tried to tell her to slow down, but Carlos raised his own glass and declared that everyone was going to drink until they were completely drunk that night. 3 hours later, the apartment was filled with empty bottles scattered everywhere. They had drunk so much that they all passed out. But the protagonist was still awake. A completely flushed Julia, who had always been extremely picky to the point of making any relationship difficult, felt that perhaps she had finally found someone who fit her ideal. Her hands rested gently on the man's chest, even if just for a brief moment. She realized she couldn't look away anymore. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming or if it was real, and even if it was, she wasn't certain a scene like that would ever happen again. She decided then that it didn't matter if it was all just a figment of her imagination or not. At that point, because of the alcohol, her vision of reality was completely blurred. When the day dawned, the sun intensely poured into the apartment through the windows. Damon's head was throbbing. Amid the confusion, he thought the room was too stuffy. Maybe Carlos had left the heater on by mistake. He instinctively felt something lying on top of him, and for a moment, he thought it was a big dog. But when he opened his eyes, he saw it was Julia, completely sprawled out on him, making every muscle in his body ache with pain. He tried to get up, his head still throbbing, not understanding how Julia had ended up sleeping on top of him like that. After carefully disentangling himself, he straightened his crumpled shirt and wondered how that girl could act with such disregard. He then walked to the other room and called out to Carlos, telling him it was time to wake up. He explained that they all had class that morning, so Carlos and his sister should go home and change. Carlos, feeling just as bad as he did, asked why they couldn't just get ready right there, since they were neighbors. But Damon insisted they leave, saying he still needed to deal with the mess they had left the night before. Then, he went into the bathroom while he heard Carlos in the next room trying to wake Julia, saying they were already late for the university. Then he heard her desperate scream, lamenting that she was so late. Damon turned on the shower that looks like a stove for some reason, feeling the hot water run over him as he thought he had clearly gone too far. His head felt like it was about to explode. However, what really unnerved him was the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. He approached the mirror, and as soon as he saw his reflection, he froze in surprise. His chest and neck were covered in bruises and bite marks. He couldn't understand how it had happened. It looked like he had been attacked by some kind of wild animal. Then, a blurry memory emerged through the flashes of the hangover. A completely drunk Julia approaching him and the feeling of her lips on his chest. Realizing what this could mean, Damon put his hand to his face, overcome by a wave of shame, and muttered out loud in disbelief, asking what on earth that girl had done to him. After class, Julia could barely put one foot in front of the other. She was nauseous, and her whole body seemed to ache. She confessed to her friend that she would probably go straight home. Her friend just said goodbye and told her to be careful on her way back. Suddenly, Julia received a text message from Damon. He asked where she was, which was strange since he never texted her out of the blue. She replied that she was on her way home but had a feeling something had happened, as it wasn't like him to reach out to her like that. As she got closer to the exit, she suddenly noticed a familiar silhouette. Damon was standing by the gates, his hood pulled down, partially hiding his face. As soon as he saw her, he called out to her in a serious tone. Worried, Julia quickened her pace toward him and asked what had happened, wanting to know if it was something about her brother. But Damon replied that Carlos was in class. This made her even more confused. It seemed like he wanted to say something important, and at the same time, he was visibly irritated. After a few uncomfortable seconds of silence, she insisted, wanting to understand what was going on and why he had called her. Damon let out a short laugh, lowered his hood, pointed to the bruises on his neck, and asked if she could see what had happened to him. Julia was in shock. The marks were really bad, but she tried to hide her discomfort and mumbled, a little annoyed, that she didn't understand why she had to hear about the love life of her older brother's best friend. He laughed again with a certain mockery, saying that he couldn't believe she really didn't remember what she had done the night before. Julia took a step back, trying to protest, saying she would never do something like that. But suddenly, the memory of the hickey on his chest came back in full force, and shame completely overwhelmed her. She didn't know what to say or how to justify herself. Damon calmly watched and commented that at least now she was finally trying to remember. Then, he took her hand and asked her to come with him. The simple touch made her heart race. She was embarrassed by everything that had happened, and even more by the impression that he was really mad at her. When they got home, he pulled her so fast that they both rushed to take off their shoes and went straight into the apartment. Julia tried to apologize again, saying her memory was all jumbled, and she barely remembered anything. Seeing the look of shame on her face, Damon concluded that she really wasn't lying. In fact, she didn't remember. When he put his hand to the hem of his sweatshirt, Julia's face turned red, and she panicked, asking what he was doing now. Damon gave her a sideways glance and said he just wanted to help refresh her memory a bit. When he took off his sweatshirt, she saw the marks on his body and let out a scream, a mix of fright and shame. Although she admired his body, she was embarrassed by what she had done. Damon stood there without his sweatshirt, also embarrassed, and told her to pay attention to what she had caused. Because of her, his body would be sore all day. Then Damon asked if she was all right, and why, after all, she bit people like a wild animal. Julia couldn't look away from him and kept apologizing nonstop. He held her chin, lifting her face so she would look him directly in the eyes, and said he wanted her to look him in the eye. He asked if she really thought a simple apology would be enough after all that. Julia was completely flustered and mesmerized, so her apologies didn't sound nearly as sincere as she wanted them to. Damon commented that with that expression on her face, the apology sounded fake, and besides, he asked why she was smiling. Julia had only seen Damon this angry once before. It was just before the midterm exams. On that occasion, Carlos wouldn't stop teasing his friend, asking when he would finally be brave enough to approach the class president and ask for notes. She didn't want to listen to that kind of conversation, especially because they were blocking her view of the TV. And she rudely told them to get out of there and stop bothering her. At that time, Damon had been staying at their house for 2 days in a row because he and Julia's brother were working on a project together. Tired of the boring conversation, she told them both to leave, saying they could very well continue the project at Damon's house. Her brother then decided to teach her a lesson and tried to start a playful fight. But because of a lack of sleep, he was clumsier than usual and accidentally knocked a can of coffee onto Damon's laptop. The problem was that the laptop belonged to Damon, and with the coffee spilled, the device was ruined, along with the entire project they had worked so hard on. An intimidating aura seemed to emanate from Damon, and the two siblings froze upon seeing him that way for the first time. Even though he remained calm, he looked like he was about to explode, and Julia remembered well how long Carlos had to beg for his forgiveness on that occasion. In reality, Damon was a very nice person, and both she and her brother were easygoing and had no problem apologizing when necessary. So Julia knelt down, clasped her hands in a pleading gesture, and began to apologize, swearing that it would never happen again and that she didn't know what had gotten into her. After all, even when she drank, she had never done anything like this before. She was sure that seeing her in that situation would soften his heart, and he wouldn't be able to stay angry. She gave him a look and said she would do anything he asked. But Damon remained still and simply told her to get up. He asked if she was the type of person who did stupid things when she drank. She replied, a little embarrassed, that she wasn't. He sighed and said he would forgive her this time, and only because it was her, but he warned her that she should never act that way with anyone else again, as it could get her into trouble. He advised her to be more careful from now on, adding that he wasn't sure if he could still trust her in the same way. Julia was relieved that he had forgiven her so easily. She nodded in agreement. Suddenly, Damon wanted to know what she would do if something similar happened again. Julia stated with conviction that it would never happen again. However, her eyes once again got lost in his beautiful chest, and she thought that maybe she couldn't guarantee that with absolute certainty. Then, with an animated air, she said that if it happened again, she would let him do the same thing to her that she had done to him. A vein pulsed in Damon's temple from so much anger, and he asked if she had lost her mind completely. 2 weeks passed, during which Julia became practically Damon's personal assistant, having to fulfill all his requests. Once again, he was ordering her to do things, and although she didn't like it at all, she was enduring it so that the situation between them would finally be resolved. Carlos, noticing his sister's strange behavior, asked his friend what he had done to make her so obedient. Damon, while playing a Nintendo Switch that might be the reason why some days there are no videos in this channel, just maybe, replied that he had no idea and told his friend to start packing for their trip. Julia appeared right after and, with a gentle smile, asked if she could leave the coffee on the table. Her brother smiled and said he also wanted a coffee made by his lovely little sister, but Julia made a rude gesture and told him not to even dream of it. All it took was for Damon to call her name, and she let out a defeated sigh, saying she had gotten the message. To be fair, most of Damon's requests were limited to coffee or small favors. For example, she had to wake him up every morning according to his class schedule. When she asked how much longer she would have to continue doing his chores, Damon replied that it would be until the marks on his chest completely disappeared. But by the end of that week, curiosity was already consuming her, and she began to wonder if he wasn't already fully recovered and was just tricking her. Julia couldn't muster the courage to ask directly, so she decided to check for herself while he was sleeping. However, as soon as she tried to reach for the buttons on his shirt, he grabbed her hand instantly and wanted to know what she was trying to do. Julia screamed in panic and was mortified at being caught in the act. She didn't want him to misunderstand, but she also didn't want to admit that she just wanted to see if the bruises had disappeared. So she made up a story that she was just trying to wake him up, as he had asked. But Damon didn't believe her and got annoyed again, asking if she was drunk so early in the day. Julia was offended by the absurd idea and protested, saying that wasn't it at all. She sighed deeply, upset that she couldn't find the courage to simply ask if his chest had gotten better. While preparing coffee, hoping her punishment was close to its end, she overheard a conversation between her brother and Damon. Carlos didn't understand why Damon didn't want to study abroad. Julia put the coffee on the table and asked why he really didn't want to go. After all, he just needed to improve his grades a little, and everything would be fine, unlike her brother, who had to pay to get in. Carlos, still not understanding the situation, asked his friend why she was so kind to him, and at the same time, so harsh with her own brother. Damon looked up from his brand new Nintendo Switch, old with amazing games, that I still don't know how it hasn't fell on his face, and suggested that maybe it was because he was staying home while his friend was about to go to another country, leaving his sister behind. Julia pouted, not understanding why he didn't want to travel with her brother. After all, it would only be 4 weeks, more than enough time for the marks on his body to disappear and for all of that to be left behind. What she didn't realize was that Damon was discreetly watching her from behind his brand new Nintendo Switch OLED. I wonder which game is that. However, back to the game, story. You know what? I'm playing Hollow Knight. Tomorrow I'll finish the story. Yes, I'm gonna do that. See you immediately, because you won't notice that I left this for tomorrow. LOL. Back to the story. His cheeks slightly flushed, thinking that the girl was as innocent and clumsy as she had always been. On Friday morning, Julia woke up in the apartment completely alone. Her brother had already left. Suddenly, she smelled a delicious aroma coming from somewhere in the house. She couldn't imagine where that pleasant smell was coming from, so she was suspicious and wondered where it could be coming from since she was supposed to be living alone for the next 4 weeks. She quickly left the room, thinking that maybe her brother had missed his flight and was in the kitchen preparing something. As she entered the kitchen, she heard a noise and immediately asked if her brother had forgotten about his trip that day. But then she froze upon seeing a familiar figure wearing an apron. The scene left her completely mesmerized, and she could barely mutter, wanting to know what Damon was doing in her apartment. Noticing the pastries on the table, she repeated the question, wanting to understand why he was in her kitchen. However, Damon simply replied that it was already too late, and if she intended to have breakfast, she'd better hurry up, wash her face, and change her clothes. Julia couldn't understand why he was preparing breakfast for her. It felt like she was in a strange dream. Finally, she said out loud that this wasn't the right time for this kind of thing, and then asked why he was doing it, if her brother had asked him for a favor. While finishing setting the table, Damon calmly replied that, yes, Carlos had asked him to make sure his sister didn't starve while he was away. He didn't even seem embarrassed, and after finishing everything, told her she should hurry before the soup got cold. Julia, on the other hand, felt quite uncomfortable. They were alone for the first time, and in the same room. Seeing all the delicious side dishes he had prepared, her mouth watered, and she asked if she could eat first and shower later. Damon sighed and wanted to know why she was asking for permission. After all, it was her house. She then ran to the table, sat down, and wanted to confirm if she had understood correctly, if he was really going to prepare her meals while her brother was away. Damon sat across from her and simply replied that he would. Julia was excited and immediately wanted to know if he would also take care of the cleaning. He smiled slightly and said yes, the cleaning would be his responsibility, but the laundry would be hers. Julia was happy to hear that, as she was used to her brother doing that kind of thing for her, and she genuinely thanked him for breakfast. When she took the first spoonful, she couldn't believe the taste. She exclaimed that it was too delicious, and even got up to ask if he had really made everything himself or bought it ready-made. He replied that he had prepared it all himself and asked her to just enjoy the meal. While getting ready for university, Julia thought about the fact that although they had lived as neighbors for almost their entire lives, it was strange to realize that in practice, they were practically living alone side by side. She used to call him that annoying idiot from the next apartment, and in the past, they barely spoke, as there was always a certain awkward vibe between them. However, after they started university, they began to talk more often. She slowly applied her lipstick, suddenly realizing that this was the first time they were really eating together without her brother present. Remembering the marks she had left on his body, Julia felt completely embarrassed and tried to act as if nothing were happening, but her heart wouldn't stop racing. As the boy washed the dishes after breakfast, Julia approached, wondering if he wouldn't end up forcing her to serve as his assistant for the entire 4 weeks. She then decided she needed to talk about it and called out to him. However, Damon asked why she hadn't left for class yet. In an almost whisper, Julia said she wanted to talk to him about something important and asked if the marks on his chest had already healed. Damon turned to her and wanted to know why she was asking that out of the blue. She got nervous and replied that he was getting it all wrong. It wasn't what he was thinking at all. He crossed his arms and, with a mischievous smile, asked if, deep down, she just wanted to know if her punishment was over. Julia swallowed hard and insisted he was misinterpreting her again, even though that was exactly what she wanted to know. However, when he took a step toward her, her heart raced, and she wondered when he had gotten so tall. Then, Damon kept the smile and asked what she wanted, if she was curious to see if his chest was healed. Julia extended her hands, trying to push him away, saying she was just worried about him and asked him not to get so close. But feeling something firm on her hands, she realized she was touching his chest again. She quickly took her hands away, her face burning with shame, and tried to explain, saying that wasn't what she wanted to do. She was just trying to push him away a little. Overcome with embarrassment, she ran out of the apartment, thanking him once again for breakfast and wishing him a good day. Damon gave a discreet smile, but soon after, he heard the girl's voice again. Julia had come back just to let him know that she had plans with her friends that night and would be having dinner with them, so he didn't need to prepare anything for her. Damon felt something strange. He found her gesture so cute that his heart skipped a little beat, and he thought to himself if this was what older brothers felt. Then he was about to go back to the sink and finish washing the dishes when he noticed her purse forgotten on the table. Julia was already putting on her shoes and was about to leave when she heard his voice calling. She replied, asking what he wanted. Damon then approached, lightly tapped her on the head with her purse, and told her she shouldn't be so forgetful. Julia let out a surprise sound and thanked him. Suddenly, he wanted to know if she was only going to dinner with girls. Julia smiled and confirmed that yes, she was going to meet her friends from her university group. After that, Damon felt a certain relief and wished her a good time, asking her not to drink too much. The day passed, and the sun began to set slowly. Julia was having fun, chatting with her friends at a restaurant. She was already holding another glass in her hand when the topic of conversation changed. The girls began to comment on the new student at the university, saying he was very handsome. One of them said she knew who they were talking about. His name was Shine. He was tall and very attractive. Another friend agreed and added that he had a lot of followers on social media and had already said he wanted to become a personal trainer. One of the girls nudged Julia with her elbow, saying it was impossible that she didn't know who they were talking about, but she didn't remember. Her friends laughed and said that at the last apartment meeting, they had seen Shine discreetly trying to sit next to her, so they were sure he was interested in Julia. She, however, didn't remember anything similar and was uncomfortable with so many insinuations, so she decided to be honest and said she wasn't interested in him anyway. One of her friends then commented that Julia had never been the type to get carried away by someone's appearance alone. Then, she changed the subject and asked the others if they had seen Julia's brother in the IT department. She said she could have sworn that the last time she saw him, he was so handsome he attracted more attention than he should have. Julia was relieved that the conversation had changed focus, but suddenly, one of her friends commented that she was sure he was already dating someone. This caught her by surprise. She took another sip of her drink and stated with conviction that her brother did not have a girlfriend. She was completely certain of it. The friend sighed with relief and commented that this was why you couldn't trust the gossip spread in student communities. Suddenly, a boy approached the group, enthusiastically saying he was happy to see his seniors. He was the boy they were talking about. He smiled broadly at Julia and asked if he could sit next to her. Julia then began to drink one glass of beer after another. As she did this, an old memory came to mind. When she first started university, she was still getting used to drinking. And on a certain day, a small incident happened. The day after a party, still smelling faintly of alcohol, she went to class. When she entered the room, she was surprised by the warm and lively way everyone greeted her. Her friend was visibly upset, asking why she always had to find things out through rumors and never directly from Julia. But Julia didn't even know what she was talking about and, confused, asked what rumor it was. The friend replied that it was being said all over the university that she and Sam were having an affair and made a beautiful couple. Julia froze. She had no idea where that rumor had come from, as it wasn't true. Later, at home, she told her brother everything, who again asked who the boy was. She replied that Sam was a senior in the department and seemed to be spreading the story that something had happened between them. Carlos was furious and said that if necessary, he would teach that guy a lesson. He demanded that his sister give him the idiot's number, but Julia replied that they hadn't even exchanged contacts, which made the rumors even more annoying for her. Losing his patience, Carlos asked if that guy had gone crazy. He then told his sister that he didn't have class the next day and would go to the university with her. At that moment, Damon entered the apartment. He had gone there to ask Carlos if he had finished his work, but he stopped when he heard the conversation. Julia tried to calm her brother, saying it was okay and that she wasn't a child anymore. However, Carlos countered, saying she was a 20-year-old child, so Damon wanted to know what they were arguing about. Carlos explained that he had just found out that an idiot was bothering his dear sister and that he was going with her to class the next day because he wouldn't let that guy get away with it. But his sister insisted he didn't need to get involved because she could handle it alone and repeated that she was no longer a little girl. Damon thought for a moment and said that she wasn't entirely wrong. After all, she was at university, she was 20 years old, and maybe Carlos was overreacting a little. She thanked Damon and stated that she could deal with this kind of problem alone. Then she turned to leave, saying the matter was closed. Her brother's overprotectiveness sometimes drove her crazy, but Damon's calm and controlled demeanor bothered her even more than Carlos's exaggerated actions. Although she valued her brother's care, She didn't want him to solve everything for her. She wanted to finally be seen as an adult. After all, she wasn't a child anymore. Meanwhile, Damon sat next to his friend on the sofa, and Carlos asked a little uneasily if, even though he thought he was overreacting, he didn't think it was better to intervene now before something worse happened. Damon calmly replied that he shouldn't have said anything to Julia, as he also didn't have class the next day. The two of them could have resolved everything together without involving the girl. Back in the present, staring at her empty glass, her mind already confused by the effect of the alcohol, Julia realized she couldn't even remember how that gossip had disappeared so suddenly. In any case, she realized she had drunk too much again and no longer felt well. Shine looked at her, noting that she was no longer as conscious, and a malicious smile appeared on his face as an opportunistic plan formed in his mind. He moved as close as possible and spoke to her, trying to sound gentle, but Julia felt uncomfortable next to him. He leaned into her ear and whispered that she had forgotten her umbrella in the classroom and that he had picked it up. He then said that the object was at his house and suggested she go there to get it. Even drunk, and with her thoughts confused, Julia felt that she didn't want to be near that boy. She became even more irritated when she remembered that her friend had left her seat with the excuse of going to the bathroom, allowing that guy to sit next to her. Now, in a discreet way, her friend even seemed to encourage the approach, as if she really believed there was something between the two of them. But Julia was clearly uncomfortable. She couldn't understand how her friend didn't see the obvious, that she had no interest at all. On that occasion, the girls were playing a drinking game called Rabbit and Carrot, where whoever made a mistake had to drink. Julia kept losing multiple times, and the more she drank, the harder it became to continue the game. Shine watched everything carefully. It was clear that she had already gone too far, but for him, this only made his plans easier. Earlier, when he mentioned the umbrella and invited her to his house, she replied that it was okay, and that she would get it later, that he could bring it to the university. Even so, the boy insisted, trying to seem charming, and said it would rain the next day, and that she should stop by so she wouldn't get wet. However, Julia was firm and replied that it wasn't necessary, as she had several umbrellas at home. The answer irritated him. The difficulty of seducing her frustrated him in a way he couldn't hide. As he watched one of the girls hand Julia another glass, he wondered why she was so cold to him, why his tricks simply didn't work. Julia could barely hold the glass properly, so he offered to drink for her. But she refused in a dry tone, saying she could handle it herself. And then she downed the entire glass of soju cocktail in one go. It was then that Swain, her friend, finally began to realize that perhaps her attempt to bring them together was completely forced, that Julia really didn't like him. The other girls also seemed to notice this, and one of them suggested it was better to end the get-together, as it was getting late, and they all agreed it was time to go home. Upon hearing that, Shine put his arm around the now completely drunk Julia and asked her friends where she lived, as he wanted to take her home. But his attitude caused distrust among the girls. Even though they studied together, he was still practically a stranger, and his enthusiasm seemed a bit suspicious. Swain quickly stood up and said that his help was not needed, as Julia lived nearby, and they would call her older brother to pick her up. Meanwhile, Damon was staring at his phone, increasingly anxious that Julia still hadn't returned home. It was almost midnight when the phone rang. He answered and asked why she was calling so late, but he heard a completely different voice. A girl said the name of the bar and said that Julia was so drunk she couldn't even walk, and asked him to come pick her up. Damon jumped off the sofa right away, ran so fast he started to sweat, and when he entered the bar, he was out of breath. Julia's friends were relieved to see him arrive to pick her up, while the other boys stood still in front of that uncomfortable scene. Damon exchanged glances with him. It was clear that the guy didn't like his arrival at all, but what bothered him most was seeing Julia passed out, sitting next to that guy, with his arm around her. Witnessing that, Damon felt anger rise like fire, wondering what the hell was going on there. He gave the stranger such a cold look that the boy immediately took his arm off Julia. Kneeling in front of her, Damon tried to understand how she had gotten into this state, so bad she couldn't even open her eyes. He tried to wake her up, but she didn't respond. Noticing that she was completely out, he lifted her and carried her on his back as if she weighed nothing. Swain handed him her friend's purse and thanked him again for picking her up. Then she watched as he walked away, carrying Julia on his back. That's when Shine silently approached and commented that Julia's supposed brother seemed really intimidating, but the girl simply replied that he wasn't her brother. She explained that Julia's brother had traveled abroad for a short period, and that at the moment, his friend was taking care of her. The boy was surprised and asked if it wasn't risky to let her leave like that with another man. Swain thought he seemed much more suspicious and dangerous, and even more so now, and replied that the two of them had known each other since childhood, being like family. Even with everything, the boy continued to stare at the two, thoughtfully, as if he couldn't accept that a man and a woman could just be friends. In the end, everyone said goodbye and went home. When he arrived at the apartment, Damon lay the drunk Julia on the bed and covered her with a blanket. Then he reflected on how careless she was, how she could act so recklessly. Then he remembered the boy who was in the group, and the anger grew inside him again, wondering if Julia didn't realize what could have happened. He was irritated with her for being so irresponsible. Still, everything had ended well, so he adjusted the blankets over her and let her rest in peace, deciding they would talk about it the next day. As he closed the bedroom door, he let out a long sigh, asking himself when Julia had grown up like that. She used to be so easy to deal with. Now he worried about her habit of drinking too much and the behavior she exhibited afterward. Then, Damon remembered an occasion when Julia was really scared. This happened when she was still a child. Little Julia had woken up during the night when she heard a noise and, thinking it was her father, left the room, asking why he was still awake so late. But in reality, a burglar, filthy and evil thief had broken into the apartment, and the attacker, fearing being discovered, ended up hurting the girl. The episode was so significant that even now, as an adult, she still trembled when she had to stay home alone at night. At the time, Damon was just a boy, and had heard that the police had gone to the building because of a robbery, but he didn't know the details. Only recently, shortly before the trip, Carlos told him that Julia had been hurt that night. It was then that he understood why her brother was so protective, and why he insisted that she never spend the night alone. Now that he had left, Damon would have to spend the night in the living room to ensure she was safe. When Julia was sleeping restlessly, she felt sick, tossed and turned, and seemed unable to find peace in her sleep. Sitting up suddenly in bed, she was overcome with intense dizziness and, for a few moments, didn't understand where she was. She stumbled out of the room, holding her head, which was throbbing violently, mentally begging for a glass of water. But when she got to the living room, she came across an unexpected sight. Damon was lying on the sofa, and his defined chest seemed to shine in the dim light of the room as if it were glowing. Not knowing for sure if she was still dreaming or if it was real, she approached, intrigued. Julia concluded that she must be in a dream. Just as a wild animal cannot resist tasty prey, she couldn't take her eyes off his muscular chest, and since she was convinced that this was just an illusion, she thought there would be no consequences. So she lightly climbed on top of him, giving in to the fantasy. Meanwhile, Damon was sleeping soundly, dreaming that a mosquito in the shape of Julia was biting him relentlessly. When morning came, he felt a weight on his chest, as if someone were lying on top of him. When he opened his eyes wide, he found the girl sleeping on top of him and, indignant, thought that she was up to her antics again, as there were marks on his body. Once again, Julia was irritating and he began to scream, demanding that she wake up immediately. Julia, vaguely hearing the shouts, slowly opened her eyes, still dazed, and asked what was happening. After a few seconds, her eyes finally focused on Damon's furious face, and in an instant, she realized with horror what she had done. She froze completely. Even after promising it wouldn't happen again, she had gotten drunk and ruined everything once more. A little later, while taking a shower, Julia anxiously reflected on what she should do now. She felt ashamed of her own behavior. She had believed that it was all just a dream, and the moment she saw his chest illuminated by the moonlight, she simply lost control. It was then that she remembered the agreement they had made. If it happened again, Damon would have the right to do to her exactly what she had done to him. Just imagining that possibility, her heart began to beat faster, but in a strange way, almost as if she was hoping for it. And this feeling scared her. She didn't understand why she was reacting like this. Damon was like a brother to her. Julia was completely confused, not knowing how she would be able to face him after that. After the shower, sitting in the living room, Julia kept her eyes down, nervously fidgeting with her fingers, clearly restless. It was obvious that he was truly annoyed with her. His intense gaze and the prolonged silence made her very nervous. After a while, he prepared tea for both of them, and, sitting across from her, asked if she understood where her drinking habits could lead her. Julia tried to defend herself, saying that she usually didn't drink so much. She tried to make a face of regret so that Damon would feel sorry for her, and she explained that it was the first time in her life she had been so drunk and that she didn't even like alcohol that much. Damon, clearly irritated, let out another sigh and wanted to know if she had ever done something similar with someone else. Julia answered right away, saying of course not, that it was the first time something like this had happened in her life. This only made Damon even more intrigued, and he asked what was happening to her, why she was suddenly behaving like that, and if she had some kind of strange taste. Faced with the girl's silence, he commented that he was thinking of taking her to a psychiatrist now, as it wasn't normal to bite other people's chests. Julia felt extremely embarrassed, but knew she needed to give him a reasonable explanation. So clenching her fists, she began to talk about her favorite actor. He had a broad, handsome chest, and it was because of him that she realized her ideal type was a man with a muscular chest. Damon crossed his arms and grumbled, asking if that meant any broad chest would do for her, but Julia immediately denied it, saying it wasn't like that. Then she began to explain with excitement that it wasn't just the width, the shape, the muscles, the feel, all of it was part of the whole package. That's why she admitted that when she saw him, she realized he was perfect in that aspect. When she noticed the expression with which Damon was watching, she lowered her head and apologized once more, saying she had overdone it. Then, Damon got up from the table and let out a long sigh. Even after all her sincerity, he decided she needed to learn a lesson, so putting his hands on the hem of his sweatshirt, he began to lift it. Julia looked surprised, not understanding what he was about to do. With a serious look, he said that he wasn't kidding last time, and reminded her that they had an agreement. If it happened again, he would return the favor in the same measure. Julia could barely believe that he was really taking it so seriously, but Damon maintained a firm look and reminded her that she had made a promise and now needed to keep it. The truth, however, was that he didn't actually intend to go through with it. He just wanted to scare her a little. Her behavior worried him, and he wanted her to understand that she couldn't act that way, especially with strangers, as she could end up in serious trouble. But suddenly, his eyes widened at something completely unexpected. Julia pulled the hem of her own sweatshirt and took it off. Damon froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. He thought she would just apologize, as she had done before. He was so confused that he couldn't even move. He thought that girl must have completely lost her mind. Damon knelt before her, and even though everything inside him said that this was wrong, he couldn't stop. As if enchanted, he approached her, touching her neck carefully to leave a mark, just as she had left one on him. At one point, a thought crossed his mind. Why was Julia, who previously barely paid him any attention, now acting so differently from the image he had always had of her? He thought he wanted to be the only one to see her that way. But suddenly, he pulled away and was shocked by what he had just done. To his surprise, however, Julia didn't seem scared at all. Instead, she began to reprimand him, saying he had crossed the line. Damon then laughed and admitted she was right. Julia then stared at his face, surprised to realize that her neighbor, who always walked around with a serious and closed expression, could have such a charming look. At some point, both of them noticed that that innocent game had crossed the boundaries of what was normal, and now they were in unknown territory. Then Damon got up and began to put his sweatshirt back on, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. A heavy silence hung between them until, in the next instant, he turned and walked to her. Then, without thinking twice, he pulled Julia into a tight hug and kissed her. At that moment, a thought crossed Julia's mind. They were entering a risky situation. Damon smiled mischievously and said sincerely that she was incredibly beautiful. Then, sometime later, Julia rested calmly in his arms, slowly falling asleep. Damon then realized that he had actually been waiting for that moment for a long time, and had finally understood the true feelings he had for her. For some reason, he remembered an episode from their school days. A girl was hiding around a corner, crying desperately. He knew the reason for her sadness. She had done poorly on her term exams, so he silently followed her and stayed nearby, ready to help her if needed. At that time, he thought she was just a silly girl who lived next door to his apartment. On that particular day, Julia came home much calmer and entered animatedly, shouting to her brother that she had arrived. Then Carlos suddenly asked where Damon was. Julia was surprised by the question and wanted to know why she should know where his friend was. Right after, a shopping bag fell on her head, making her scream in fright. Turning around, she angrily asked what his problem was. Damon then replied with an impatient tone that he was older than her and that she shouldn't talk to him that way. Then he handed her the bag, turned around, and went to the door, telling Carlos to hurry up because they were going to the cyber cafe. Julia looked at the bag strangely. When she opened it, she found only sweets and snacks, which surprised her. So it seemed Damon had bought all that just for her, but she couldn't understand why. Carlos, noticing that his sister was examining the sweets, asked his friend why he had brought that. Damon replied simply, saying there was no reason at all. He, although he had only recently understood his feelings, realized that he had actually liked her for a long time. So instead of continuing to hide what he felt or trying to comfort her with sweets, he decided he wanted to open his heart once and for all. It was night outside, and the moon shone high in the sky. Suddenly, Julia's eyes opened, and for a few seconds, she tried to understand where she was and what had happened. As soon as she realized what she and Damon had done, she jumped up, horrified by the memory. Clearly, they had both lost their minds for a moment. Right after, she noticed she was wearing his t-shirt. It was soft and had a pleasant smell. Just thinking that Damon had put it on her while she was sleeping made her a little embarrassed. Silently peeking into the kitchen, she saw him standing in front of the stove. She didn't know how to act around him after what had happened, and she had no idea how he would act now. But even so, the smell coming from there was so delicious. He cooked like a true chef, and she simply couldn't resist her hunger. Suddenly, Damon turned around when he heard a small noise behind him and smiled, saying she was already awake. Julia didn't know what to expect from him and was surprised to see him so kind. Then she froze in place when he approached. Right after, his hand delicately wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. Then he gave a gentle kiss on her forehead. Julia, overcome with confusion and astonishment, looked at him with wide eyes. Damon spoke affectionately that they could sit and have dinner together. She replied, stammering that it was okay. I sat down at the table while he served the dishes, and the whole thing felt strange, different from any situation she had ever experienced. He was acting as if he were her boyfriend, but when he sat down across from her, Julia thanked him for the meal. She felt so uncomfortable that she might have run away if the food hadn't smelled so good. Damon, on the other hand, continued to smile and commented that she should no longer drink outside the house. Upon hearing that, Julia couldn't stop thinking about the kiss he had given her on the forehead and the way she was being treated. Everything seemed so out of the ordinary. So she decided to clarify everything at once and asked, a little agitated, if what had happened between them had been just a passing thing. With a mischievous smile, Damon replied with another question. He wanted to know what exactly she was talking about because after everything they had been through, it was obvious that they were going to start dating. Julia froze, still with the spoon in her hand, unable to immediately process what he had just said. It was difficult to form a sentence in her own mind where the words she and he were accompanied by the word dating. She asked if it wouldn't be strange. After all, for the past 10 years, she had always treated him like an older brother. And besides, she questioned what Carlos would think. Damon, however, showed no doubt or embarrassment. He replied naturally that there was nothing wrong with it, as they weren't even related. Then he wanted to know why they couldn't date. As for her brother, they just needed to tell him everything, honestly. Julia stared at him for a moment and realized he was right. What she liked most about this possibility, in fact, was the fact that if they really started dating, that chest would be completely at her disposal. But she soon lowered her head and covered her face with her hands, remembering the only reason why she might not want to get involved with Damon. He was incredibly jealous. There was a time when she, her brother, and Damon were drinking together at a restaurant, and he commented, without thinking twice, that he would do anything for his girlfriend. Carlos then asked what he would do if, even after so much effort, the girl cheated on him. Damon replied that he would do everything to ensure that this never happened. But when they asked what he meant by that, he said he would cut off any contact the girl had with other men. At that moment, Carlos and Julia exchanged glances and silently came to the same conclusion. He was completely crazy. Carlos still wanted to know if in that case, Damon would also stop talking to all the women around him. Without hesitation, he replied that he would block them all. No discussion. Julia nervously drank from her glass as she listened to her brother argue with his friend. Carlos insisted that Damon would never be able to isolate his own girlfriend from the entire world. After all, she would still need to go out to work. But Damon countered by saying that wouldn't even be necessary. Upon hearing that, Carlos exclaimed, outraged, asking if by any chance he planned to lock the poor girl inside the apartment. Meanwhile, Julia remembered how she used to wonder why such a handsome guy didn't have a girlfriend yet. Now she understood perfectly. Despite all the charm of his calm demeanor, he was simply too possessive. Julia always thought he would never be able to maintain a relationship, and now she was shocked to realize that she was the one who had become his girlfriend. Damon smiled brightly and wanted to know what she was thinking about so intently, telling her it was better to eat before the food got cold. Julia also reflected that it didn't make sense for him to want to date her out of real feelings. The most likely scenario was that he was just trying to take responsibility for what had happened between them. So she questioned if it wasn't strange to start a relationship for just that reason. Since neither of them felt anything so profound yet, it still seemed more sensible to go out a few times, get to know each other better, and only then decide if it was really worth continuing. Deep down, she believed that in time, Damon would realize that they weren't a good match. Damon's face became serious, and in a calm but firm tone, he asked if she really thought relationships were some kind of game and wanted to know if she was making fun of him. Then, he carefully held her hand. Intertwining his fingers with hers with gentle strength, a shiver ran through Julia's body. She looked at him in surprise. Damon then brought her hand to his own lips and gave it a light kiss before saying that, in the end, she was the one who came after him first, and therefore, she should take responsibility for what came next. Later, standing in the bathroom, Julia stared at the marks on her arms. Julia thought Damon wasn't a dog, but looking at her own arms, it seemed like she had been bitten by a mad dog. Her whole body was covered in marks, and she had no idea what to wear, so that no one would notice. In front of the mirror, she talked to herself, remembering that Damon had even demanded that she take on the responsibility, and wondered if this was how relationships really worked. But earlier, when she pulled her hand back, she said that if he insisted so much, she would indeed take on the said responsibility. Damon then seemed satisfied and smiled, saying that was exactly what he wanted to hear. With a flushed face, Julia continued eating, finding him really strange. But suddenly, she felt something odd and became even redder. She asked him what he was doing, if he didn't realize that was her leg under the table. Damon was sliding his own leg against hers, with a playful smile on his face. Right after, he slightly pulled the collar of his t-shirt, revealing his collarbones, and commented that since she had agreed to take responsibility, he wanted to know if she was interested in exploring that chest that she admired so much. When Julia saw that, she even let her spoon drop, overcome with a kind of amused anticipation. Back in the present, she realized she had been defeated by her own weakness. If she hadn't been so obsessed with that damned chest, she wouldn't have given in so easily. Suddenly, she felt his arm wrap around her waist. He stood behind her, holding her carefully, and asked why she had taken so long. Then, he brought his lips to the back of her neck and gave it a soft kiss. A shiver ran through her body as if it were a shock. Julia even liked the feeling, but everything was still so recent and embarrassing that, not knowing how to react, she called him a pervert and told him he needed to stop that kind of behavior. She called him a pervert while leaning against the sink, and with a sarcastic look, she told him to look at all the marks he had left on her body. Damon replied ironically, saying he couldn't believe that she, of all people, was saying that. He lifted his own t-shirt, revealing the marks scattered across his chest and neck, and stated that between the two of them, the real pervert was her. One only had to look at the masterpiece she had left on him. Julia then pulled his t-shirt back down, remembering that they both had class that day, and suggested they go to the university together. She asked him once again to stop trying to seduce her. Damon replied that he knew exactly what he was doing. If he continued like that, she would end up falling madly in love with him. Without letting her say anything else, he kissed her suddenly while Julia thought anxiously that because of him, she certainly wouldn't get enough sleep that night and would still be late for class. The next morning, Julia miraculously managed to get to the university on time. She sat in her chair, but her mind was far away. She kept wondering if Damon was able to pay attention in his own classes. Yesterday he was so focused on her, but today, surprisingly, he seemed calmer, almost pensive. She then sent a message asking if he was already in class. He replied that he was and said that his class would end at 5:10 p.m. Julia then commented that hers would also end at the same time. He then suggested they have dinner together and asked her not to leave without him. Julia smiled as she looked at her phone screen. She thought the emoji he used matched him perfectly. She realized she was acting like a foolishly infatuated girl, and when she realized that, a spontaneous smile appeared on her face. Turning her eyes back to the computer screen, she began to wonder if Damon had always been so adorable. Her class ended a little earlier than expected, but she decided to wait for him, as they had agreed. As she walked down the hallway, she passed two girls and, unintentionally, overheard part of their conversation. They were talking about a cherry-flavored lip balm that made kisses even tastier, and apparently, there was even a challenge trending at the moment, putting on lip balms with different flavors and making your boyfriend guess the taste. Julia stopped for a moment, finding the idea curious. She then began to rummage through her bag as if looking for something. She soon found her lip balm. Hers was strawberry flavored. She put it on her lips, trying to convince herself that it didn't mean anything and that her lips were just dry. After that, she quickened her pace. She wanted to go to Damon's room and give him a little surprise. But she didn't notice the boy coming in the opposite direction. It was Shine. As soon as he saw her, he recognized her immediately and called her name. Since Julia didn't stop, he held her arm, gently pulling her to get her attention. He smiled at her and asked where she was going in such a hurry. Julia immediately pulled away from him as if she had touched something hot and angrily asked what he thought he was doing. Shine put his hands up and apologized, saying he didn't mean to scare her, he was just happy to see her. Julia stared at him with suspicion. His overly friendly manner made her uncomfortable, especially considering they weren't that close. So she wanted to know why he had called her. The boy replied that he just wanted to know if she had gotten home okay. He explained that he didn't have her number, so he couldn't contact her to confirm. He then asked if she could give him her phone number. Julia didn't like the situation at all. She didn't want to misinterpret, but she felt he was trying to flirt with her, and that was something she had no intention of encouraging. So she just replied that she wasn't interested and that she already had a boyfriend. Shine was very surprised, but he didn't give up. He claimed that he had heard she was single. Julia replied firmly that things had changed now. It was then that Damon appeared behind her and called her name. She was immediately excited to see him. Shine gave Damon a look of contempt, clearly bothered to see him interfering in his business once again. Meanwhile, Damon exuded an intimidating aura, but he tried to maintain control and asked, in a gentle tone, what Julia was doing there. She ran to her boyfriend so quickly that Shine didn't even have time to react. Julia then approached Damon with a smile and said that it was time to go. Damon exchanged a warning glance with Shine. He didn't like seeing him nearby again. Damon then smiled slightly on purpose and put his arm around her waist, saying it really was time to go. The two turned and left, embracing, leaving Shine standing there, just watching as the two walked away. He adjusted the brim of his cap and thought, confused, that she had said Damon was like family, but now everything seemed very different. Inside the car, Julia fastened her seatbelt and heard Damon comment, with a slight tone of jealousy, that she was clearly popular with guys. She was startled and replied that it wasn't true, but he looked directly at her and said that yes, she was very beautiful, and many men noticed that. Julia thought with a certain discomfort, okay, I'm bumping into the wall called possessiveness again. Still, up to that point, she had a hard time accepting it and thought that none of this would be happening if it weren't for Shine. She feared that Damon would fully enter possessive mode, but suddenly, she felt his fingers silently intertwine with hers in a calm and gentle gesture. She was cured and asked if he was jealous of her. He ended up admitting that he was dying of jealousy. It took her a few seconds to absorb what she had just heard, and to her surprise, she felt something good about that confession. Then she let out a light giggle and said she found it funny. She had never seen her neighbor that way. Damon, a little offended, asked what was so strange about that and wanted to know if it wasn't normal to be jealous of your own girlfriend when another guy was trying to flirt with her. Julia explained that to her it was strange. They hadn't even really started dating yet, and he was already jealous, and despite so many years of friendship, something like this had never happened before. It was then that Damon gave a mischievous smile and said that she had no idea he had been jealous of her for a long time. Julia was surprised by that revelation. Her heart raced, her eyes widened, and she asked if he was saying that he had liked her for a long time. Damon lowered his eyes and confessed that he had, that for a long time he had tried to ignore that feeling, even to himself, but that was exactly what he felt. Julia screamed, completely incredulous at what she had just heard. He had just confessed that he loved her. A mixture of happiness and excitement took over her chest, and she began to ask, almost without breathing, how long he had known this, and said that it had never even crossed her mind that he felt something for her. She always thought he had only asked her out because he felt guilty about what had happened between them. Damon then admitted that he had liked her since high school and added that it had nothing to do with responsibility. If that were the only reason, he would never have gotten involved with a friend's younger sister. And as he approached her, he made it clear that from the beginning, he had his own reasons for wanting to be around. Then he kissed Julia tenderly, and she felt a warm and welcoming wave grow inside her chest. It was hard to believe that all of that was really happening. He had never shown his feelings so clearly, and to think that the same boy who had teased her for 2 weeks just because she touched his chest had actually liked her all this time. She moved away a little and asked, with a suspicious look, if he really expected her to believe all of that. After all, until recently, he had made her prepare coffee, wake him up in the morning, and even take care of several small tasks. Damon admitted that until then, he had thought she had only done it because she was drunk, and that maybe she was the type who went around touching people on impulse. He said he was surprised to realize that she was interested in him and not just playing around. Then he held her hand and said that now she could touch his chest as much as she wanted, the same one she admired so much. When her hand rested on his chest, Julia suddenly asked if he had ever heard of the lip balm challenge. He replied no and wanted to know what it was about. She explained what she had heard from the girls in the hallway, the challenge of putting on flavored lip balms and letting your boyfriend guess. Then she wanted to know if he wanted to try it, but he just remained silent for a moment and then asked her to put her seatbelt back on. Later, they went to the movies, and Julia felt a little strange. This made it clear that they were really on a date. Damon commented that he had bought her favorite combo, half salty, half caramel popcorn, and a Coke. Julia thanked him, and he explained that he had bought tickets for the earlier show so they wouldn't miss their reservation at the restaurant. She replied that it was fine. Julia took a sip of her drink and looked at Damon's hands, thinking that since they were on a date, maybe they should hold hands. Suddenly, she heard his voice and panicked, thinking he was reading her mind. But unexpectedly, Damon covered his chest with his arms and, embarrassed, asked her not to touch him in public. Julia was astonished, turned her face, and asked what he thought she was. Damon shouted that he was being annoying and took a step forward. But then he stopped and said he took back what he said, that he was just acting silly. Damon smiled and asked what was wrong with her, saying she was so beautiful that his heart even raced. Julia then got annoyed again and told him to hurry up, telling him to be quiet too. Soon they were sitting in the movie theater, and Julia sighed as she ate popcorn. The romantic movie was boring, and she thought they should have chosen a suspense one. To her surprise, Damon was completely engrossed in the movie. She sighed once more and decided to at least enjoy her favorite popcorn. She then reached her hand toward the bucket but missed. He felt her hand there while Julia thought that popcorn was too weird. He then smiled at her and asked what she was doing. Julia apologized and said she had missed. Upon realizing the size of what was in her hand, Julia thought that eggplant was bigger than she imagined. In the next instant, he held her hand and said that if she wanted, they could leave early and spend some time together in the car. Julia stared for a few seconds, feeling embarrassed, but she didn't want to rush things. So she replied in a low voice that she preferred to finish watching the movie. Then, she pulled her hand back and returned all her attention to the screen. At that moment, an intense scene was happening between the main characters. The girl was jealous of her lover and demanded a test of love. Julia pretended to be interested, but inside she found the story strange and uncomfortable, as it reminded her of the recent conversation with Damon when he confessed to being jealous of her. She shrank into her seat, crestfallen, wondering if it wouldn't have been better to have agreed to go with him to the car, and questioned if he was mad at her now. Meanwhile, Damon was also barely paying attention to the movie. His thoughts revolved around Julia. He watched her carefully and realized that she seemed focused on the screen, which made him even more embarrassed by the suggestion he had made. Maybe she just wanted to watch the movie now. He wondered, did I offend her? Did I scare her with my insistence? The night was coming to an end, and on the way back home, they stopped at a convenience store. Julia, excited, suggested buying some beers, which surprised Damon since they had eaten a lot. He didn't think he would be able to drink beers, but even so, she happily ran ahead, saying she would also get some snacks she wanted. He told her not to run so she wouldn't fall. When Julia got to the refrigerator, her smile disappeared. She was nervous, feeling uncomfortable. Throughout the night, she had only touched him once, and by accident, but even after the movie, she realized that Damon was controlling himself. During dinner at the restaurant, she noticed how tense he was, which made her even more nervous. Even now, inside the store, she could still feel the consequences of her thoughtless gesture. She tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor and act as if she hadn't noticed anything, but it was getting harder and harder. That scared her. She wanted to understand how he could stay excited for so long. After getting the snacks and drinks, she went to the checkout where Damon was already waiting. She concluded that he was simply a pervert. No matter how much she thought, it was the only explanation. Then, while he was paying for the purchases, Julia's eyes widened in surprise. She looked out the store window and called him to see. It had started to rain, and it wasn't a weak drizzle. She extended her hand, and the drops began to hit her palm. Damon offered to buy an umbrella, but Julia said it wasn't necessary since their house was very close. However, after thinking for a bit, she commented that she had left her sweatshirt in his car, so maybe the umbrella would be useful. But when she turned and saw what he was doing, she blushed instantly and screamed, asking what he was doing. Damon was in the middle of the store, taking off his clothes. She was embarrassed and wanted to know why he was doing that, taking off his own sweatshirt right there. He just looked at her and, without saying anything, put it on her. Julia was completely speechless. His clothes were too big, but they were cozy, and his scent enveloped her in a pleasant way. Damon pulled the hood over her head and said lovingly that she could catch a cold if she got wet. Then, he put his arm around her, smiled, and said it was time to go. Enchanted, Julia followed in silence. She had no idea he could be so affectionate. The store clerk, a young man, watched the two of them leave and thought sadly about how they made a beautiful couple. That made him feel very lonely, just like the editor who is doing this that perhaps will never in his life get a girlfriend. I'm so sad for that LMAO. I mean, sad. Their house was across the street, but the curtain of rain only seemed to get more intense. Once inside the building, Julia felt relieved to realize that, thanks to Damon's sweatshirt, her hair hadn't even gotten wet. She thanked him happily, but soon heard his voice, asking why she was still trembling, if she was cold. She replied, "Maybe a little," and then stared. Unlike her, Damon was completely soaked. His white t-shirt clung to his body, and as he ran his hand through his wet hair, droplets spread in the air. The scene was so attractive that Julia couldn't take her eyes off him. Suddenly, Damon covered himself and said that she was looking at him like a pervert again. She blushed and denied it, saying it wasn't true, but then asked, embarrassed, if it was really that obvious. Damon smiled slightly, his cheeks also flushed, and said it was okay. In the elevator, Julia suggested they go directly to the apartment so he could dry off. As soon as the door closed behind them, shoes and clothes began to fall to the floor in a disorganized way. Damon kissed her sweetly, holding the back of her head, while she tried to tell him he needed to take off his soaked t-shirt. Finally, he brought his hand to the hem of his shirt, which was uncomfortably stuck to his body. Noticing Julia's attentive gaze, he leaned in with a provocative smile and said that she could touch him as much as she wanted. The girl carefully ran her hands over his shoulders, and both of them shuddered. They were overcome with emotion. Right there in the hallway, Damon dropped the last pieces of clothing on the floor and guided Julia's hand to touch him. Nervously, she asked if it would fit, and he replied that they would only know by trying. Julia thought that she had wanted this for a while, so she stood on her tiptoes and asked him to be gentle. Then Julia sighed and said it was difficult, and Damon asked her to just relax. It didn't take long, and Julia melted into his chest, saying she couldn't take it anymore. Sometime later, the two of them were lying in the bathtub. Julia complained, indignant, saying that her legs were hurting because of him. Damon apologized, although his satisfied face made it clear that he wasn't really sorry. He offered to give her a massage, but Julia firmly refused, saying that he was up to his antics again. Damon, already brushing his teeth, commented that she seemed about to pass out. He reminded her not to forget to brush her teeth and asked if he should get a toothbrush for her. Julia sighed and said that she was completely exhausted because of him and that he should help her himself. She thought to herself where he got so much energy and wondered if he really liked her that much. Hearing her ask for help, Damon asked excitedly if he could really lend a hand. Julia got annoyed and asked if he was thinking of something silly again. When he carefully held her chin, she was startled, thinking he wanted to start all over again, but he calmed her, saying he really just wanted to help her get ready for bed. Surprised, she stared at him. She could barely believe what was happening. She wondered if he was really so in love to the point of wanting to brush her teeth and help her lie down. Damon then smiled tenderly, as if talking to a child, extended the toothbrush toward her mouth, and sweetly asked her to open her mouth. But seeing her flushed face and that strange look, he stopped and asked if she was okay. He then commented that she seemed feverish, but Julia replied that it was just from being in the hot water for too long and asked him to hurry up. The next day, she felt great. Classes had ended, and she was putting away her materials when she heard someone call her name. Julia, turning around, saw her friend, who was hoping that Julia didn't have any plans that day. The girl wanted to go out for a drink and a chat, but Julia hesitated and said it probably wouldn't work out. Sue became sad and commented that lately, her friend was always stuck with her boyfriend. Julia apologized and promised to make it up to her another time. Even so, her friend insisted, saying it had been forever since they had last gone out or talked, and that she was dying to know how she was. Julia then thought there wasn't much to tell. After all, she and Damon had barely left the bed in the last few days. Then, she remembered the promise she had made to her boyfriend not to drink outside the house, and because of that, she told her friend that she couldn't go out because her parents had come to visit. Upon hearing this, Suane stopped being annoyed and replied that since she was going to be Julia's brother's future wife, she could then say hi to her future in-laws for her. As soon as the conversation ended, Julia ran down the stairs. She was late and in a hurry to meet Damon, who was already waiting for her in the car. Suddenly, someone pulled her coat so hard that she almost fell, barely able to keep her balance. She froze, trying to stay on her feet and wondering what was happening. Who would grab someone like that while they were running? That scared her. When she turned around, she realized she was right. It was Shine. He had appeared out of nowhere again, as if he had the right to act that way. Blushing, he quickly asked, almost out of breath, if she could give him a moment. He needed to talk about something urgently. His face looked sincere and distressed, which surprised Julia. So she decided to listen to him and asked what he wanted to say. The boy was genuinely nervous. He had accepted the fact that she felt uncomfortable around him and that he was willing to stay away, especially after she had said she had a boyfriend. However, after recently seeing a disturbing scene, he couldn't simply ignore it. Shine said that a few days earlier, he was walking through the parking lot while smoking when he heard a girl's scream and recognized the voice. It was Julia. Deciding to see what was happening, he saw the girl with her boyfriend and froze. What he saw made him uneasy. Julia was screaming and asking the guy to put her down, but her boyfriend seemed unconcerned, carrying her on his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, saying that she was making a big fuss. Julia, in turn, hit him with her small fists and insisted on being released. Then, he saw him throw her into the car as if she were some random object. Shine froze, unable to understand why she was with someone who treated her that way. So he couldn't keep quiet, which is why he was here now, telling Julia that he had seen it all and that he was genuinely worried about her. He asked why she was with someone like that. Julia blushed deeply and said she had no idea what he was talking about. She put her hand to her mouth, horrified as she remembered that day. She was extremely embarrassed and didn't even know how to explain the situation. Meanwhile, Shine continued to be distressed, saying how loudly she had screamed. He said that he was about to run to her, but the car drove off so quickly that he couldn't catch up. And since then, he hadn't stopped thinking about whether she was okay. Julia immediately remembered that day. She and Damon were going to the car, and she began to bombard him with questions about whether something had happened between him and that girl from school, the class president. He was astonished and wanted to know how she knew about that and why she was bringing the subject up now. She was referring to the moment when she happened to overhear a conversation between Damon and her brother, Carlos. Carlos had been teasing his friend, asking when he would finally take some action regarding the class president. Julia remembered this conversation and commented that on that same day, her brother had damaged Damon's laptop along with their group project for the midterm exams. He adjusted his cap uncomfortably and said that was a long time ago and she had nothing to worry about. She had expected him to react with surprise and asked if he thought she was jealous, but his serious look bothered her. Her intention was just to joke, but now her mind was full of other things. So she grabbed his shirt and wanted to know why he didn't talk about the subject. After all, he had said that she was his first, just as he was her first. So she asked what all that meant, if it was a lie. In the next instant, he held her hand and interrupted her outburst, explaining that it was nothing like that. He said he had gone to ask the class president for a cheat sheet for the test, but she said she would only help if he agreed to date her, so he refused her. At that time, he didn't want to get involved with anyone, but the rumors that they had started dating spread quickly, even though it was just a misunderstanding. Since he didn't want everyone to start talking about it, he preferred not to touch the subject. Deep down, he was afraid that Julia would get upset over something so silly. She felt embarrassed, saying that she wasn't angry. She just thought it was bad that he had never told her the truth, as she had believed the rumors were real. Damon immediately realized that she was jealous and could barely hide a contented smile. At that moment, he found her irresistibly adorable. Julia got irritated and wanted to know why he was laughing at her. He replied that it was because she was charming and asked, in a good-natured tone, if she was really that in love. Awkward and uncomfortable, she tried to defend herself, saying it was nothing like that she was only with him because of his broad chest. But Damon continued to laugh and commented that it even hurt to hear, even though he knew it was a joke. Still shaken and frustrated that he had mocked her reaction, Julia replied that he would see if it was a joke or not and provoked him, saying that the day his chest shrunk and a beer belly appeared, she would trade him for another guy. At that moment, Damon's smile disappeared. With a serious look, he spoke in a threatening tone that she had better stop playing with that kind of thing. She, defiantly, retorted that she wasn't playing. He sighed deeply in disbelief and suddenly got up, throwing her over his shoulder. Julia asked what he was doing, and Damon gave her a light pat, saying that she should wait until they got home. Then she would see what he would do to her. Back in the present, Julia remained there, hiding her face in shame, thinking about how she would explain to Shine that he had only witnessed a silly couple's argument that had gotten a little out of control. However, she soon realized that she didn't need to give any explanation. So she said firmly that they weren't close enough for him to ask that kind of question or get involved in her personal life. Furthermore, she questioned why he thought it was okay to grab someone like that. It had scared her, and he shouldn't act like that. Shine scratched his head, clearly embarrassed, and said he thought something serious was happening and just wanted to talk. But even so, she replied firmly, making it clear that they didn't have intimacy and that she preferred he didn't show so much interest in her from then on. Then, she turned abruptly and walked toward the parking lot, leaving Shine behind. He stood still, feeling guilty but not understanding why she had reacted so harshly to his concern. After a while, Julia finally arrived at the parking lot and got into the car. She apologized for the delay. Damon smiled and said it was okay and asked if anything had happened. The girl thought about Shine, but preferred not to tell her boyfriend anything. She still remembered the previous conversation when Damon had shown jealousy and didn't want to cause any more misunderstandings between them. She just put on her seatbelt and said that classes had ended a little later that day. Damon accepted the explanation, but with a somewhat forced smile. A little later, while Julia was reading a message from her friend, she asked how his day had been, and he just replied that it was peaceful. Yes, his voice sounded strange. After all, the two of them had been neighbors for years, and Damon was her brother's friend. Julia knew him well, including his habits and mannerisms that went unnoticed by others. She knew, for example, that he wasn't exactly impulsive, but made it very clear when he was sulking. Well, his classic trio of signs was always the same: contracted eyebrows, impatient sighs, and fidgeting with his bangs. Exactly what he was doing at that moment. He thought he hid his emotions well, but that wasn't true. Julia watched in silence, trying to understand what had made him uncomfortable. Suddenly, when they got home, Julia went straight to the shower, while Damon sat on the sofa in front of the TV with a brand new Nintendo Switch OLED ready to be used by me, but stuck in a Manhwa where I cannot be. Oh, there is also a PS4 that cannot run the Sparking Zero, so it doesn't matter that much. However, he was thinking about how he could break the tense atmosphere. Julia decided that the best way to make amends was by seducing him. She put on his big sweatshirt and went to the living room. With an innocent look, she asked in a whiny voice for him to help her fold the sleeves, as she couldn't do it alone. He approached slowly, and with an expression that was difficult to interpret, Damon began to fold the sleeves to make her more comfortable. But to her disappointment, he still kept his eyebrows furrowed. Maybe it was strange, but Julia found him adorable that way, and on impulse, she ended up kissing him. She sat on his lap and ran her hand over his chest. Even so, he didn't react, just gave a vague look at her hand. Despite Julia's efforts to win him over with affection and kisses, he pushed her hand away and turned his face, avoiding the kiss. She was shocked and hurt. That had never happened between them. So she asked what was happening, if he was ignoring her on purpose. Then, to her surprise, Damon let out a big sigh and asked if it was true that the only thing she liked about him was his defined chest. Julia froze, perplexed, wondering if he was really that foolish, if that was what had been bothering him all this time. So she stared at him in silence, while he wrapped his arms around her waist and said he just wanted to understand why she was with him. He hugged her tightly, his heart beating fast with nervousness, and said that if she was only with him because he had somehow pressured her, then he was very sorry. Julia interrupted, saying he was confusing everything. She ran her hand through his hair and stated that yes, she liked his body, but it had nothing to do with pressure. It was something real. She liked him for real, and the fact that he had pressured her had no relation to her feelings. She held his face in her hands and, with a smile, said he was just being silly. She was with him because she truly loved him. Her declaration touched him deeply, but even so, he still wanted to know what else she liked about him besides his chest. Julia then kissed him tenderly and replied that in the beginning, yes, that was what caught her attention the most. But now she was with him because she truly loved him and that he didn't need to worry about those things. It was then that Damon told her that when she was late getting to the parking lot, he went to look for her and ended up seeing her talking to that same guy from before. He said that when the guy asked her why she was dating him and she didn't answer anything, it hurt, and since then, he started to wonder if she was only with him out of obligation. Julia understood, feeling relieved to finally understand why he had been sulking on the way home. She wanted to explain everything, but Damon looked at her, relieved to have finally put into words what had been gnawing at his mind all night. Julia then gently held the back of his head, pulling him close, and said he was a real grump. Before he could say anything, she added that she loved him exactly as he was and kissed him once more. As she pulled away, Julia commented calmly that she was in love with a completely obsessed guy who acted like a child and had a very big thing. Then she adjusted the sweatshirt that was slipping from her shoulders and said that she also didn't like guys who didn't get hints. After all, she had also been upset. Damon then lifted her into his arms, saying he would remember that next time, and wanted to know if she liked provoking him so much. Julia wrapped her arms around his neck and, with a light smile, replied that she did, and she liked it a lot. He carried her to the bedroom and leaned over her with a mischievous look, saying that she would pay dearly for provoking him like that. But before he could continue, he was surprised by her. Julia turned firmly and straddled him, and with a daring smile, said that that night she was in charge. And to be honest, Damon should have absolutely no complaints. Then she caressed his body delicately and provoked him, asking mischievously if he wanted her to continue or not. Suddenly, he pulled her closer and kissed her intensely. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in London, it was still daytime. Carlos was lying down, lazily scrolling through his newsfeed on his phone when he suddenly jumped up upon seeing a flashy post on one of the university community pages. Someone had written that one of the most handsome guys in the computer science department was dating, and that the lucky girl was a beauty from the administration department. Carlos was intrigued. This could very well be referring to Damon, but he wanted to understand since when he had a girlfriend and why the hell he hadn't told his best friend anything. So for a moment he thought about his own sister since she also studied administration, but he soon dismissed that possibility. Then he considered that maybe Julia had introduced some colleague to Damon. This bothered him. After all, his sister had never wanted to introduce any friend to her poor older brother. Damon was soon bombarded with a barrage of messages from Carlos, who forwarded the post and wrote that he wouldn't get away with this. He was absolutely sure it was him. He wanted to know if Julia had introduced him to any friend and why he hadn't said anything about this supposed dating until now. He also asked if his little sister was eating properly. Damon replied briefly, saying that he himself made sure that Julia ate 3 times a day. But Carlos continued to insist, saying he would feel betrayed if he found out the rumor was true and his friend hadn't told him anything. Meanwhile, Damon watched Julia sleeping in his bed, exhausted. After the intense reconciliation they had experienced, he still didn't want to reveal the truth to his best friend. So he changed the subject, asking if Carlos had managed to get a girlfriend in London after all. He kept saying that all he had to do was get there to win someone over. His friend replied, complaining that the professor had lied and that there wasn't a single girl in their program. Julia slept deeply, breathing serenely, murmuring Damon's name from time to time. He delicately moved the strands of hair from her face and caressed her cheek lovingly. As he looked at her, he realized how much his feelings had deepened. He felt his chest warm up as he saw her there, so calm, surrendered to that moment of peace. Damon quickly typed the last response. He told Carlos that they would talk in person when he got home. Carlos looked at his phone screen, surprised, wondering if Damon was really hiding something, and if he was dating, why he simply wouldn't admit it. The next morning, the table was once again filled with appetizing food. Julia, delighted, thanked Damon for dedicating himself so much every morning and preparing such a delicious breakfast for her. As she sat down at the table, he commented casually that he had received a message from Carlos. He said he would be back next Friday. Julia stopped for a moment. That meant they only had 1 more week. After that, her brother would return, and she was sure he would freak out upon discovering that she and Damon were dating. She wished he would stay away for more than 4 weeks. Damon noticed the worried look on her face and asked why she was so down. Julia sighed and replied that she wished her brother would never come back. Right after, trying to soften what she had said, she admitted that it sounded horrible, but the truth was that Damon cooked much better than Carlos. While she was speaking, he wiped a crumb from her lips with his thumb. Damon smiled and said he was happy to have met her high standards. In a playful tone, he asked if it wouldn't be better to kick Carlos out for good and go live together. Julia blushed instantly. She couldn't resist when he spoke like that, especially with that serious and firm look. She wanted to know why he said it with so much certainty, because if he continued like that, she wouldn't be able to say no. Then he laughed excitedly, loving to make her flustered, and asked what he should do with a girl like her. Right after, he held out his hand, held hers firmly, and asked if she agreed with the idea. With their fingers intertwined and her heart beating faster, Julia replied that she most certainly agreed. She said she couldn't even imagine eating her brother's food again and guaranteed that she would definitely go live with Damon. But classes hadn't been canceled, so the two headed to the university. During the professor's explanation, Julia could barely pay attention. The news of her brother's return wouldn't leave her head. She was sure he would freak out when he found out about her dating Damon, but she imagined that in time he would end up accepting it. What made her most uneasy was the fact that when Carlos and Damon were together, they seemed to live in a world of their own, and she feared that everything would go back to the way it was before. Just imagining her brother dragging her boyfriend to gaming cafes or any other place just to spend time together, she already felt angry. So Julia was typing angrily on her laptop, annoyed, thinking if it wasn't time for Carlos to get a wife and move out, that way he would finally leave the two of them alone. But then, without warning, she blushed at the thought of whether it was too soon for her and Damon to get married. Then her thoughts were interrupted when Sue-Ann appeared and asked why she was still in the room, since class had ended a long time ago and everyone had already left. Julia replied that she was so distracted thinking about her life that she didn't even notice. Sue-Ann took the cue and asked if Julia was free that day, as she wanted to finally schedule that coffee that was always postponed because of her friend's boyfriend. Julia was about to refuse, but then she had a brilliant idea. Everything could be easily solved if Carlos was also in a relationship. Suddenly, she asked if Sue-Ann still wanted to be introduced to her brother. In the late afternoon, the two went to a cozy cafe in the area. On the way, Julia called Damon and told him she would be back in time for dinner, asking him not to worry. Watching the call, Sue-Ann wanted to know if it was with her boyfriend. Julia confirmed and immediately asked if she had sounded too sweet or even too in love when talking to him. Sue-Ann reassured her, saying it was fine and that all couples behave like that during the honeymoon phase. Meanwhile, Julia wondered if she should really introduce her friend to her brother. Deep down, she thought Sue-Ann was too good for him. But surprisingly, her friend herself showed interest, asking more about Carlos. Then, Sue-Ann asked directly if it was true that Julia was planning to introduce her to her brother. Julia ended up confessing that she was actually dating his best friend, and that when Carlos found out, he would definitely freak out. Because of that, she thought it would be easier for him to accept the relationship if he was also dating someone. However, now that she thought about it better, Julia felt bad for trying to use her friend as a distraction and admitted that Sue-Ann was right. It had been a long time since they had hung out like that, and she apologized for bringing up the subject of her brother. But to her surprise, in the next moment, Sue-Ann slapped her hands on the table hard and told Julia to stop. With a determined expression, she put her hand to her chest and declared with enthusiasm that she really wanted to meet her brother and that Julia needed to introduce them, promising that she would do everything she could to win his heart. Julia, a little stunned by the unexpected reaction, said that in that case, she would introduce the two of them as soon as he returned. She commented that she was happy that Sue-Ann was interested in Carlos, but confessed that she was afraid that she was idealizing him too much, commenting that when she met him for real, she would realize how extremely annoying he could be. However, Sue-Ann blushed and suddenly said that it wasn't just about his appearance. In fact, there was something she needed to tell Julia, something that had happened a long time ago. She began to talk about the time when rumors arose at the university that Julia and Sammy were having an affair. Sue-Ann said that at that time, Sammy was going around telling everyone that something had happened between them, and Julia was outraged, stating that she had barely exchanged a few words with the guy. The girls around them began to criticize the guy, while Sue-Ann felt a twinge of guilt, as she herself had started the rumor, believing that Julia liked Sammy and wanting to help them get together faster. Now she realized the confusion she had caused and knew she needed to fix the situation. While walking down the street, Sue-Ann didn't know how to face her friend. She wanted to apologize as soon as she resolved everything, and could only hope that Julia would forgive her. The next day, Sue-Ann was in front of Sammy. She had called him to convince him to stop spreading rumors about her friend. The guy replied that it was Sue-Ann who had started everything, but she accused him of lying, saying it was he who had told her at that time that Julia had said she liked him. Approaching arrogantly, he asked if she had any proof that he had said that, leaving her flustered. She repeated that he himself had said so, but the guy insisted, claiming that she had no evidence and that no one would believe her, especially since it was she who had suggested spreading the rumor. He raised his hand as if to hit her, shouting never to speak to him like that again. The girl raised her hands, scared, trying to protect herself with tears in her eyes, but nothing happened. She heard a voice asking Sammy if he was done, and she opened her eyes carefully. As she did, she saw that a man was holding Sammy's hand and staring down at him, saying firmly that they needed to talk. While Julia's brother dealt with the aggressor, Damon appeared beside Suen and asked if she was okay, to which she replied yes. Carlos took a step forward and stated that he knew Sammy had gone to Seoul, and that he had friends there who told him the guy was a pervert who stalked girls. Sammy tried to defend himself, asking what that had to do with him, and why he was meddling where he wasn't wanted. Carlos replied that it had everything to do with it, as it was about his younger sister. In the next moment, Damon advanced without hesitation and grabbed the guy by the collar. His expression was that of a complete maniac, leaving Sammy visibly scared. Damon then said that if he even approached Julia again, he would personally make sure he was expelled from the university. Meanwhile, Carlos turned to a scared Suen and asked if she was okay. The girl, still trembling, replied that she was now. Right after, she couldn't hold back and started to cry. She felt deeply guilty, especially for being in front of her friend's brother. Carlos tried to comfort her, imagining that he had scared her and apologized, but she quickly guaranteed that it wasn't his fault. Suen then confessed that it was she who had started the rumors about Julia on campus. She wanted to tell the truth to her friend, but was afraid that she would get angry and never want to see her again. To her surprise, Carlos didn't get angry. He just laughed and commented that his sister was really scary when she was angry. Because of that, he and his friend had come in secret. If she found out, they would be in trouble. He delicately wiped the girl's tears and, trying to calm her down, asked her to keep their presence there a secret. Suen agreed but said she still needed to apologize to her friend. Meanwhile, Damon was recording Sammy's promise on his phone that he would never again approach or talk to Julia. Carlos then gave Suen a charming smile and commented that she must be a freshman since she was friends with his sister. Then he added that everyone makes mistakes when they are young and that she shouldn't be so hard on herself. He advised her to apologize to Julia at the right time, as she would understand and forgive her. Then, he asked her to always remain a loyal friend to Julia. The girl blushed and agreed, and from that day on, her heart belonged to Carlos. After hearing her friend's story, Julia commented that Carlos was very annoying, always acting like an adult, even though he was only a few years older than her. Suen nervously held her cocktail glass and said she knew it was late, but still wanted to apologize for everything. Julia calmed her down and thanked her for her sincerity and for the apology. She admitted that Carlos was right. If she had found out at the time, she wouldn't have even listened to the explanation. But now she wasn't upset at all, understanding that her friend just wanted to help. Suen felt as if a weight had been lifted from her chest and hugged her friend tightly, saying she was the best. Julia patted her back and, still in her arms, began to wonder what had really happened to Damon. She remembered how he didn't let his own problems get him down, but had secretly gone to confront the aggressor for her. Then the two talked a little more and soon headed home. Julia was eager to hug her boyfriend. When she arrived, she quickly took off her shoes and ran to him, her heart overflowing after hearing her friend's story. Damon was about to start dinner and said she had commented that she wanted to eat tteokbokki, but he couldn't even finish the sentence. Julia ran toward him and jumped into his arms. She felt even more in love with him. Damon held her, surprised by the reaction, and asked her to be more careful. Julia didn't answer, she just hugged him tighter and gave him a quick kiss on his forehead. He was confused. It felt good to feel so much affection and energy, but he wanted to know what had happened to make her so happy. The girl looked at him with a soft and loving expression, confessing that she had realized how much he really loved her. He then replied that she already knew that, so he wanted to understand why she was so emotional now. But Julia asked what he would do if one day she got really angry. Damon adjusted her better in his arms, smiled, and said that, of course, he would try to calm her down and please her. She then wanted to know what if it wasn't his fault. The guy replied that even so, he would take responsibility as if it were, but that in any case, he hoped she wouldn't get angry for no reason. Julia laughed happily, her chest overflowing with emotion, and between laughs, she said he was silly and that he must be completely in love with her. Yes, Damon still didn't understand the reason for that sudden joy, but he was happy to see her radiant and replied that yes, he really was. Julia then held his face in her hands and thought, how can this man be so incredibly adorable, dangerously adorable? Then she pulled him close, kissing him intensely, while she decided, deep down, that there was no scenario in which she would lose Damon, only over her dead body. Damon hugged her with affection, maintaining the kiss and smiling. Julia laughed and asked if he intended to love her for the rest of his life. As he sat down on the sofa with her in his lap, he didn't answer immediately, which made the girl demand an answer right away. It was then that Damon thought of something he had never considered before. His feelings didn't scare him, they were strong and true, and because of that, he replied sincerely that he would love her forever. Deep down, Julia had always dreamed of hearing that, even though the idea made her a little apprehensive. Moved by impulse, she suddenly asked if maybe they shouldn't get married. His face twitched in surprise upon hearing those words, and he froze. Such a beautiful moment was suddenly interrupted by a wave of fear. Looking at her with wide eyes, Damon asked what she was talking about. Seeing his reaction, Julia became cautious and questioned what was wrong if he didn't want to marry her. Damon, embarrassed, said it was nothing like that. He had just been caught off guard. Julia felt a pang of hurt and, turning her face away, asked him to forget that conversation had happened, as if nothing had been said. She was then overcome with shame, asking herself why she had imagined he would like the idea. But he didn't want to pretend that nothing had happened. He delicately held her hand and explained that he had just been surprised by her suddenly starting to talk about marriage. Still embarrassed, Julia looked away and replied that he had said he loved her, and she loved him too. Besides, Carlos would be back soon, and she didn't want her brother to take Damon away from her, so she thought it would be a good idea. The boy let out a sigh of relief before commenting that this was what had been going through her head all along. He smiled and said sincerely that she didn't need to worry. Even when Carlos came back, he wouldn't leave her. It wouldn't be that easy to get rid of him. Gently holding her hand, he asked her to give him some time, and in the meantime, for her to also think and decide if she really wanted to marry him. But still smiling, Damon pulled her into a hug and said that, although Julia was being a bit childish, he was very happy to hear those words. But Julia pouted, thinking that there was nothing childish about her proposal. She really wanted to marry him. 4 days later, Julia went to a bar to meet her friend. The two clinked their beer mugs, happy to finally be able to hang out together. Sue-Ann was surprised that Julia had been invited and had even ordered a drink, since she normally refused because of a promise she had made to her boyfriend. Julia, with a tense expression, took a big gulp while searching for the right words, until she suddenly revealed that her boyfriend had been ignoring her for the past few days. This shocked Sue-Ann, since her friend always said he couldn't live without her. When Julia admitted that she had asked him to marry her a few days earlier, Sue-Ann was speechless and asked if she wasn't rushing things. After all, they hadn't been together for that long. Julia panicked and shouted that she knew that, but the words just escaped. The worst, however, was his reaction. Indignantly, she said that he thought she was joking, which deeply offended her. She felt that he still didn't see her as a woman, but rather as a younger sister. Since that conversation, he had been avoiding and distancing himself from her. Then, lowering her head onto the table, Julia began to cry, saying that before, he never took his eyes off her, and now he looked away the instant their eyes met. Sue-Ann tried to comfort her, saying that she was probably exaggerating, but the girl looked up with teary eyes and asked what she should do now, as she felt that he was disgusted with her. Smiling, Sue-Ann commented that it was obvious that Julia had no experience in relationships and offered to suggest something. Raising her eyebrows with a mischievous smile, she said she had heard that certain men went crazy with special surprises. She gave Julia a meaningful look, hoping she would understand the suggestion immediately. Julia began to reflect, and a plan formed in her mind. The next day, thanks to express delivery, a package arrived for her. When she opened the box, Sue-Ann's words came to mind, encouraging her and guaranteeing that it would work. Blushing, Julia took a small piece of lace fabric from inside. She wasn't sure if Damon would like it, since she had no experience with this type of situation, but she decided it was worth a try. After changing, she felt embarrassed, but told herself there was no turning back. She looked at her cell phone on the bed and decided it was time to call her boyfriend. When he answered, she tried to sound as calm as possible as she asked where he was and if he would be home soon, adding that she was very hungry. A few hours earlier, Damon couldn't stop thinking about the recent conversation. He recalled Julia's marriage proposal and felt his heart race. Upon arriving at the jewelry store, he asked the clerk to show him popular ring models. The saleswoman presented couples rings and engagement rings, asking what type he was looking for. Immediately, the image of Julia wearing that ring with a radiant smile came to his mind. He wished she would like his choice. He, a little embarrassed, pointed to one of the engagement rings and said he would take that one, asking them to finalize the purchase quickly, as he was in a hurry. It was a classic model with a small stone in the center, but for some reason, it immediately caught his attention. The clerk praised his good taste, and Damon blushed, as he said he planned to propose to his girlfriend. She, with the smile of someone who knew that situation well, asked if he knew her ring size. He scratched the back of his neck, hesitated, and admitted that he didn't know the exact number, but that her fingers were very thin and small. He added that he would probably be able to guess the size by touch. The clerk then handed him a sample of sizes. After trying on a few models, Damon found one that seemed to fit her fingers perfectly. Noticing how small it was, he thought about how delicate Julia's hands were. It almost seemed like he was buying a toy ring. He mentally concluded that he needed to feed her more. Back in the present, Damon was at the market when he received Julia's call, asking where he was. He replied that he was buying groceries, and she, surprised, wanted to know why he had gone alone. Damon said he also needed to resolve a work matter, and to change the subject, he asked what she wanted for dinner. The girl, in a suggestive way, said that for dinner, she preferred that he just come home soon. Sighing, he lowered his head, realizing that he had been cornered, and promised he would be back as soon as possible. A little later, Damon entered the house, carrying 2 bags full of groceries, announcing loudly that he had arrived. Julia peeked out of the room, still embarrassed, but eager to see his reaction. Meanwhile, with his back to her, he began to take the groceries out of the bags, saying he would prepare the spicy chicken that she liked so much last time. Julia interrupted him, calling his name. As he turned around, the instant he saw her, Damon dropped the bags on the floor. He just took one look at his girlfriend, and all the air left him, and any other thought disappeared. While he stared at Julia with the utmost calm, she reminded him that she had already told him on the phone what she wanted for dinner. Her fingers slowly began to play with the buttons of the shirt she was wearing, as she looked at him expectantly and told him to follow her. A little later, in the bedroom, Damon commented that he was pleasantly surprised and asked what motivated her to prepare something like that. Julia, blushing, replied that it was all his fault. In the last few days, he had clearly been avoiding her. When she invited him to go to the movies, he ignored her. When she suggested they go out together, he refused and dodged her, whereas before he used to take her everywhere. This left her worried, afraid that he had gotten tired of her. Damon reflected on how in the last few days he had been so busy with the preparations for the proposal that he hadn't noticed her worries. Now, looking at her, he understood that he had probably hurt her and apologized, saying that he had been busy and regretting that she had felt that way. Then, he approached and asked if she had really done all that just for him. Julia, even redder, said she didn't even know if he would like it. With his face close to hers, he whispered that everything that came from her was something he liked and that she shouldn't have worried. She looked at him with admiration and realized that all her worries had been in vain. Standing in front of her, Damon smiled sincerely and said that she was simply incredible, making her heart race. Then he leaned in to kiss her, and Julia hugged him tightly, pulling him even closer. Sometime later, Damon was lying down, smiling with happiness, and said excitedly that he loved surprises like that, and wouldn't mind if she did it every day. Julia replied that it wouldn't be fair if it was only one-sided, so she also expected surprises from him. Surprised, he asked what else she had in mind. Julia asked him to promise not to say no, but without being able to resist, Damon agreed and asked what she wanted. She, all excited, said that she really wanted to see how a male harness would look on him. A few days later, a package arrived for Damon, and he stared at the contents, unable to believe he had spent money on that. Some of the items, in fact, he hadn't even ordered. They must have been put in by mistake. Hearing Julia's voice, he was startled and dropped what he was holding. Julia peeked into the room and asked if he was going to pick up her brother at the airport the next day. He confirmed with a nod. Upon seeing that he was holding a box, she wanted to know what was interesting in there. He hesitated, discreetly pushed the fallen item away, and replied that it was nothing special. Then he tried to get her out of the room, saying that he had already asked Carlos to call a taxi, as he intended to take her to the movies and spend the whole day with her. 3 days later, the car crossed the city at dusk. Damon was at the wheel, reflecting on whether he had prepared everything and considered every detail. Noticing Julia's pensive expression, he asked if she was okay, if she wasn't feeling unwell. Julia replied that she was very worried about Carlos's return the next day and confessed that she was nervous. She asked if he wasn't also worried and if her brother decided that Damon wasn't worthy of her and forbade the relationship. The Serene boy asked since when she worried about that kind of thing. Besides, if Carlos forbade it, he wanted to know what she would do then. The girl replied nervously that it was nothing like that and that he knew very well. Trying to comfort her, he gently placed his hand over hers and said that although her brother's opinion was important, there was no chance of him breaking up with her. He placed a loving kiss on her hand and stated that Carlos would understand everything, and with a mischievous smile he added, especially when her brother realized that she couldn't live without his incredible chest. Julia then pulled her hand back, blushing, and said she would kill him if he said something like that to her brother. Damon laughed excitedly and replied that she could try. The girl smiled and threatened him, asking him to at least park the car first. Sometime later, Damon was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, his heart racing, almost jumping out of his chest. He repeated to himself that everything would go perfectly. He had bought flowers, a ring, and even reserved an incredible hotel room. He also set aside a suit to impress Julia. Meanwhile, Julia admired the luxurious hotel they had stayed at and was surprised to realize that he had rented a room. From the bathroom, Damon replied that he had worked so hard to make the apartment impeccable before Carlos's return that it would be a crime to mess it up again before his arrival. The girl threw herself on the bed and, a little sad, asked what would happen now if they would really pretend in front of her brother that nothing had changed. The boy wanted to know what she meant by that, and Julia, looking at her cell phone, replied that before, it was as if Carlos had two houses. He would spend the whole day at Damon's apartment and go home at night. Damon asked if that really bothered her. She continued to lie there, not realizing that he had already left the bathroom, and questioned if she was the only one thinking about how they would resolve that situation. Annoyed, she thought that was exactly why the idea of marriage had occurred to her. She didn't want to live separately, so she said, ironically, that in that case, he could sleep alone every night, as before. But she was startled when she saw her beloved in a completely unexpected way. Damon looked at her tenderly, wearing the suit he had bought just to please her, and holding a bouquet of flowers. After a moment, he said he wanted to say something important. Lately, he had been afraid to sleep alone without her. It was clear that he was nervous, but he continued, confessing that the idea of waking up in a world without Julia by his side scared him deeply. Julia was paralyzed with shock, unable to believe that it was really happening. Then her heart began to beat faster, and tears of joy accumulated in her eyes. Damon knelt before her, holding the bouquet with trembling hands, and asked if she would marry him and share her life by his side. Emotional, he became a little clumsy and forgot to get the ring right away. Then he put his hand in his pocket and finally revealed a small velvet box in the palm of his hand. He didn't have time to say anything else because Julia, overcome with emotion, threw herself into his arms, knocking him to the floor and holding back her tears of happiness. She replied sincerely that of course she accepted. Then, she approached his face with a wide smile and asked what that seductive outfit was. The boy smiled and said that she had asked him to surprise her, so he did his best, asking if he had managed to impress her by leaving a kiss on her neck. The girl replied that he was driving her crazy and that harness should become a permanent part of his wardrobe. Then she slid her hand over his chest and asked if she could take a picture to keep as a souvenir. Suddenly, the idyllic moment was interrupted by a call. The two looked at the phone, and Julia asked if he was expecting a call so late. Damon replied, no. Maybe it was Carlos calling to ask him to pick him up the next day. They decided to return the call later. Meanwhile, Carlos had returned home earlier than expected. He had lied about the flight to surprise them and returned not on Friday, but late Thursday night. However, upon arriving, he didn't find anyone at home, and Damon didn't answer his calls. Suddenly, his eyes fixed on something fallen on the 4th floor. What he saw surprised him. He wanted to understand what the hell that monstrous thing was doing in his house. It was very late when the young couple returned. Julia was still grumbling about how Carlos had almost ruined everything again, while Damon, as always, tried to calm her down, saying that he probably called just so as not to wake up his sister. The anxious girl asked if they were going to tell her brother about the relationship at that moment. The boy replied that if she was worried, they could postpone the conversation. Julia looked shyly at the ring on her finger. It was beautiful, and she struggled to contain the wave of emotions that was overwhelming her. She then decided it would be better to tell him and to do it together. Meanwhile, Carlos came out of the bath and, drying his wet hair, began to grumble, saying that he had asked Damon to take care of his sister, since she couldn't sleep alone because of nightmares. But then, he froze in shock when he saw Damon with Julia and asked what the hell was going on there. The two young people were side by side, and he wanted to know why they had arrived together. Damon and Julia, visibly embarrassed, tried to explain how it had happened, tripping over their own words. They made up a story that the girl had gone to the movies and that he had just gone to pick her up. But Carlos remained confused, trying to understand exactly what the two were talking about. Then he asked why his sister had bothered Damon for something so silly, and on top of that, gone to the movies so late at night. Julia, irritated, retorted, asking why Carlos had said he would only arrive the next morning, but instead, he showed up late at night and disturbed Damon. Carlos got worked up and wanted to know what right his sister had to treat him so coldly, since they hadn't seen each other for so long, and asked if she didn't miss him. The siblings stared at each other, exchanging looks that seemed to spark in a silent battle. Damon tried to intervene, saying that deep down he knew they were happy to see each other and that they should stop acting like children. He added that he was really happy that Carlos had returned earlier, and then he turned to his friend, saying there was something he wanted to talk about. Carlos replied that he was waiting for Damon to finally come clean, and that his silence had hurt. After all, now he had a girlfriend. The boy froze in panic and asked when his friend had found out. Carlos said that in the last conversation they had, Damon mentioned that he would tell him everything when he returned to Korea. He added that on the university forum, they said the girl was from the business department, the same as Julia. Julia then asked if he had known all along, commenting that she had worried for nothing. Carlos hugged his younger sister and said that of course, he already knew, and that now she should feel guilty. Right after, he questioned why she hadn't introduced this girl to her brother first, and why she only helped Damon. Julia was surprised and realized that her brother had misunderstood everything. Impatient, she asked what he was talking about and stated that she was the girl who was dating Damon. For a few moments, Carlos's mind went into an intense process of reasoning. Then he remembered what he had recently found in his friend's room. He put all the clues together, and the fact that Damon hadn't answered his calls when he imagined what his best friend could have done to Julia, he felt pure horror. But in the next moment, fury took over his body, and he clenched his fist tightly. Everything happened too fast. Carlos grabbed Damon and punched him in the face, shouting and asking how he dared to hit on his younger sister while Julia tried to separate them. The next morning, Carlos was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head down in despair, wondering if he had gone too far by punching Damon. Meanwhile, a tempting smell of freshly prepared breakfast came from the kitchen. Carlos peeked out of the room and, even still annoyed, admitted to himself that the food his friend was preparing on the stove had a delicious aroma. Without turning around, Damon noticed the movement behind him, asked if he was already awake. Then, he turned and asked him to sit down, saying that they needed to talk anyway. Some bruises were visible on his face. Carlos asked if it hurt a lot. Arranging the table, Damon replied that he was fine, and that even if Carlos wanted to hit him again, he would let him. Damon, as he sat down, looked seriously at his friend and said that Carlos had known him since childhood and knew what kind of person he was. He stated that he trusted himself to make Julia happy and that he would endure as many punches as necessary to prove it. Damon then asked if Carlos really believed that he was not capable of taking good care of his sister. Carlos, suspicious, asked if he did, would Damon break up with her? Upon hearing his friend reply yes, Carlos shouted, calling him a real scoundrel. Damon replied that he loved Julia, but if his best friend truly believed that he would hurt her, then he would trust him and walk away before something irreversible happened. With a heavy sigh, Carlos leaned back in his chair, admitted that he was a smooth talker, and accepting the situation, asked him to take good care of Julia and wished them a disgustingly happy life together. Damon laughed excitedly and said that that was exactly what he intended to do, no doubt that even grumbling, Carlos would end up approving the relationship. A little later, Julia sat on her boyfriend's lap, hugging him, and said that she felt a little better, as she was really worried about what had happened the night before. Damon then replied that everything was now resolved, and that they could finally move in together, with Carlos living nearby. Julia, who had heard part of their conversation in the morning, asked if he would have really broken up with her. Damon smiled, and wanted to know if she would be that upset. The girl complained, asking what kind of answer that was, and stated that she would have no choice but to punish him for making her worried. Laughing, he asked what kind of punishment she was planning. Julia replied that she would apply her standard, most severe punishment, pretending to be scared. He said that she needed to look at his chest immediately. Maybe that way she would have pity on him. The girl then smiled slightly and said that she wasn't sure if that would help, that she needed to look first and then decide. Then she got on top of him and the two burst out laughing, playing and enjoying how everything had worked out so well. 2 years passed since these events, a period in which a lot happened. First of all, Damon and Julia went to her parents to ask for their blessing to get married. Their reaction was a bit mixed. The father was surprised and didn't understand why Julia had chosen Damon of all people, while the mother was absolutely delighted. Damon was embarrassed, and Julia didn't know how to describe that situation. But the real drama happened when they visited Damon's family. His nephew made a fuss, saying that he would never forgive his uncle for getting married and breaking the promise to remain single forever. The girl took a long time to calm the little one, holding out her arms and asking him to stop crying, calling him for her hug. She apologized for making him sad and hugged him, even as he repeated that he would never forgive them. After receiving the blessing of both parents, they registered the marriage, but decided to postpone the ceremony until Julia's graduation. One morning, Julia was getting ready for classes when she heard Damon's voice, asking where she was going so early. She replied that she needed to go to the university. He gave her a kiss on the cheek, asking her to be careful, and wished her a good day. Carlos, who still lived next door, always asked them to reduce their displays of affection in front of him. That day, he asked his sister to help him with some documents when she got home. Over time, he and Damon had become very close, to the point of opening a business together. After graduation, Julia often helped them, as they were both terrible with paperwork. Smiling, she replied to her brother that if it wasn't urgent, she would help when she got back. Damon wanted to know what time she would finish, offering to pick her up, but Julia thanked and refused, knowing he had a lot of work. College was coming to an end, and upon meeting her friend, Julia was surprised, as she had no classes that day. Sue-Ann explained that she just needed to go there to resolve a matter. As for Sue-Ann and Carlos, things were still in the flirting stage. From what Sue-Ann said, she and Carlos had talked about the relationship and both admitted that they liked each other. Carlos asked Sue-Ann to give him some time to stabilize the business, and only then would he formally introduce himself so they could officially start dating. Julia thought that was a little strange, but Sue-Ann agreed. For her, it was a really noble gesture. That was Julia's graduation year, and her mind was taken over by thoughts about her thesis paper. Classes ended late, and one night, while walking down the street, trying to warm her frozen hands, she heard a familiar and beloved voice calling her name. Damon was there, leaning against a car, wearing a suit and a long coat, incredibly attractive. Julia was surprised and emotional that he hadn't followed her recommendation to rest and still had gone to pick her up. She ran into his arms, hugging him with joy, and asked why he hadn't stayed home. Soon, with concern, she commented that he should have rested, since he had been so tired lately with all those long nights. He smiled and said that just looking at his beloved was enough rest. Then he asked if she was cold, and she replied yes, to the point of feeling like the world was ending. Damon opened his coat and pulled her to his chest, wrapping her in it, and stated that in that case, he needed to save the world for her. Then Julia rubbed her face against his chest, happy, and declared that the end of the world was officially canceled. Suddenly, he wanted to know if she wanted to work with him after graduation. But Julia felt something on her hands and asked if he was wearing that harness she liked so much again. He decided to check, and when he slightly lifted his shirt, she saw him smile mischievously and say that if she agreed to work at his company, he would wear that every day. Excited, she agreed and asked if, in that case, she should call him boss. He laughed, and she said she wanted to be alone with him as soon as possible, suggesting they book a room, since Carlos was at home, moving around. Then Damon approved the idea, picked her up, supporting her on his shoulder, and smiled with satisfaction. She, equally happy, shouted playfully that her boss was the best. Sometime later, Julia was lying down, panting, completely exhausted. She tried to push Damon away, asking him to stop provoking her like that, as she no longer had the strength. At that moment, his phone rang. He answered and remained silent for a few minutes, just nodding as he listened. Then, he said he would pass the message on to Julia. Worried, she wanted to know if everything was okay and if something serious had happened for him to call so late. Damon asked if she remembered the export consultation they had received for the company. She realized that he didn't seem excited and replied yes. She recalled how apprehensive he had been, saying that if it didn't work out, they wouldn't get the necessary investments. Sitting up on the bed, he explained that they had just received an email confirming that they wanted to start working with the company immediately. Julia hugged him with relief and joy, considering it excellent news. He returned the hug and stated that she had to agree to work at the company with him because he would be very busy and couldn't bear to see her infrequently. She agreed, and he said it would be an honor to work alongside her. The girl leaned in and, in a whisper, commented that he would have to show her his muscular chest every day, thinking that after graduation, she would have to dedicate herself a lot to work. She kissed him, feeling grateful that everything had worked out so well in her life, remembering that everything had started with a mistake made under the influence of alcohol. Pulling away slightly, Julia smiled, looked into Damon's eyes, and asked if they should celebrate and order alcoholic beverages to the room. He smiled and told her not to play with that. The two were overflowing with happiness, and so this beautiful story came to an end.